So if you're like me, you've probably clicked on this video because you want to know more about what are the benefits and how to go about doing a 3-link install, specifically in this case in a G-body, but it can be applied to pretty much any car based on how you go about fabricating your brackets and that kind of stuff. Going to go over some of the benefits over, in this case, what a triangulated 4-link or a different type of suspension would be, why I'm making that change, and different ways that we can go about tuning it because of that. Now, if you've done a ton of research like I have trying to find information on being able to set up and tune a 3-link for road race or handling applications, you kind of come up with a big fat zero. I mean, most of the stuff end up being 4x4s for like rock crawling and off-road kind of stuff, and otherwise it's typically you run into 4-link stuff for drag racing, and there's just not a ton of information about doing a 3-link and how to do it right. And I'm by no means an expert at this. I'm making this up as I go as far as making it fit, but I think it's a worthwhile cause, and this is the way I'm going to go about it. As you can see here, I'm working with an 85 Oldsmobile Cutlass, so a G-body application. This is going to be a triangulated 4-link from the factory, and while I've been able to come up with a good suspension setup for it as far as making the rear end handle, it still leaves a lot to be desired. Mainly what it lacks is the ability to make good off-corner traction, and while I can do things to improve that, they tend to be hand in hand with making corner entry worse. And I like to have it currently set up with the 4-link where it rotates real easy, so the car is set up with rear steer. And I like it where I can come into a brake zone and turn it into a corner and be able to roll a lot of speed where I can just lightly be on the brakes, trail braking, and get the car to really rotate. And having the rear steer set up really helps that. And I didn't want to get too far away from that because I do like that rear steer aspect, but I need to be able to make it work in a way where I can keep my corner entry and mid-corner, but be able to get more power down on exit. And what I'm really looking for out of doing this 3-link swap is being able to redo the arm angles and the way they mount to the rear end so that I can have it still get rear steer in there so I can tune it either more or less depending on how I want to set it up based on feel how it drives. But I also want to be able to make it where it's going to be able to plant the tires better on corner exit. The nice thing about going to a 3-link over the 4-link is I should be able to make a better window of operation where I'm not going from such one extreme to another. That's the real hard part about the 4-link to figure out, is because with it being a triangulated 4-link, the arms are not very long on the top to start with, and they only get effectively shorter when they're angled out at such a big angle. And the big thing there is you end up with a super short arm on top and a quite a bit longer one on the bottom. So by converting over to the 3-link, we're going to try to lengthen that upper arm. This will even out the changes based on roll in a corner, and it should also help keep the pinion angle in line, whereas right now I know it goes through a pretty drastic change where it pitches forward or back depending on how the suspension's moving around. So one of the big changes with going to the 3-link over a triangulated 4-link is that you need to control the axle side to side. Triangulated 4-link does that by having triangles in opposite directions. So the upper arms are facing out and the lower arms are facing in to the front of the car, that is. And that basically holds the binds, if you will, because the forces are acting in different directions, so they hold against each other. That's what keeps the axle centered. On a 3-link, that's not the case, so we need to run a Panhard bar or a Watts link. I've decided to go with the Watts link because I can keep the axle dead center, and I'm running a pretty tight tire to fender clearance, and I want to make sure that I'm not going to have rubs. How we're going to go about that is I'm making myself a prop. This makes up the center of the Watts link, and then we'll have a bar going in each direction off of it. You need to try to make sure the bars are level when they get installed in the car, as well as having them mounted on the chassis in the exact same distance apart from each other vertically as they are on the prop. That would make them level. We also need a way to mount it to the rear end, and since I want mine to be adjustable, this is the key thing that comes into play with going to a 3-link, is we have a way to adjust the roll center. You can also do this with a Panhard bar based on where the two end links of the Panhard bar, by moving them up or down, can change the roll center. Same thing with the Watts link, except we're moving the prop up or down. This is my starter plate to be able to do that. I'm just going to have these set of bolt holes and this bridge that I'll end up welding together that will encapsulate the prop. And then I'll have the ability to move it up or down. I've set this up so that the one of these centermost holes can be center of the axle, center line, and then by going up or down, we can change the handling, especially on the rear of the car, based on how much it rolls. And when we move that up or down, that will change the leverage effect that the car has in the rear, thus increasing or decreasing the amount of roll that the rear end will see in a corner. The other thing I mentioned earlier is trying to put a longer upper arm in it. This is a 10-inch arm, and then once the rod ends go on it, should come out around 13 inches in arm length. The stock lowers on the 4-link, which I plan to reuse, are roughly 19.5 inches long. The uppers are, I believe, around 11 3/4 or something like that. I don't remember exactly off my head. The problem that comes in is, because you think 11 to this 13 is not going to be that big a deal, and it wouldn't be. The problem comes in just because of the triangulated 4-link. While that arm lever might be 11 and something long, it's at an angle. So the effective length of that arm is much shorter than 11. I believe the effective length is around 8 inches. It might even be a little less with the factory setup. So instead of having the triangulated arm at an angle like this, I'm going to be mounting this arm straight in line with the chassis and being able to take advantage of its full length. Now, they won't be able to make this and have it mount to a similar location due to fitment and trunk floor clearance and all that. I won't be putting it dead center on the axle. I'll actually be offsetting it to the right side, or passenger side of the axle. This is a very common thing, and actually it ends up getting done quite a bit on race cars to combat a bit of a torque steer effect based on throttle application. What that'll do is this mount that I've made will tuck up into the factory cross member. It'll put the pivot point in the front roughly in the same place. So what's going to happen is the rear axle is going to end up here for center line somewhere. So I'm actually going to have a bracket that's offset to the rear to be able to hook up to the back side of this arm. And that's not an uncommon thing either. It's actually done quite a bit in circle track applications. What it will do is it will change the pivot point of rotation as far as what our pinion angle change is going to concern. But it's just something to work around. We're actually wanting the longer arm length because it's going to help with weight transfer and evening out them arm lengths. And because I've made the front adjustable, I also plan to make the rear adjustable. We'll have a pretty large range of adjustment to tune with. And the reason for trying to get as large of a range to tune with as possible is because that gives us options and the ability to tune it. If I just put 1 point on either end, I'm stuck with that, and the only thing I've got to tune with is then any adjustment I might have on the lower. And basically, there's nothing that we're going to be hurt by or lose by making additional adjustment than we actually need. Now, when I talk about pinion angle, the goal with that is to minimize the amount of out of alignment it is with the transmission in the engine, because any out of alignment makes this accelerating and decelerating every time the U-joint goes around. That actually makes kind of a surging motion in the rear axle and thus at the tires. So we want to keep that to the absolute minimum as possible. We could completely eliminate this with a parallel 4-link, but that takes up more space, it's more fabrication, and for the fitment on this chassis, it just doesn't work out real well to go that route. If you're looking for a really good video of explaining why and how that affects, you can look at Garage Fab's video. I'll put a link in the description. That video really opened my eyes about what actually happens with the pinion angle, and just watching that video I realized just how bad my triangulated 4-link factory setup is with where I've had it set up for my racing with a lot of roll steer in the back. I'm really moving that lower arm around, and with the upper arm pointed in the other direction, it makes some pretty drastic pinion changes. And that's something I definitely want to make better if I can with the new 3-link setup. Now with the 3-link setup and with the triangulated 4-link, the arms are kind of going to end up like this. And what that does is as they move, especially when this shorter arm, it goes through a short arc, while the longer arm goes through a longer arc. So if you think about it, the lower arm is coming up during compression, and it's pushing backwards because it's coming into level. And the upper arm is already at a downward angle, and as it goes up, it's pulling forward. So what that's doing is that's twisting the rear end and dropping the front of the pinion and increasing the angle to the drive shaft. That's what we want to try to minimize if the bar angles will work out handling wise. There's going to be no perfect fix for that unless it's a parallel 4-link. So by being able to have adjustment on the upper link and get it closer to level, even just having the upper link level and still having some angle in the lowers, it's going to minimize how drastic of a change that is. So that's one of the goals that I'd like to address when converting to the 3-link here, and why I want to get as long of an arm on the upper as I can. Now I want to talk a little bit about roll steer or rear steer. This is something we're keeping by going with the 3-link that the triangulated 4-link currently has. Now this is the lower arm. You won't be able to see the upper in here, but the upper is up at a height about like this, and it tends to aim downward a little bit. I've actually modified the chassis side and the axle side before to try to level that arm out as much as I could, but it was still downward at about 6 degrees or something like that. But the big thing here that controls roll steer is the lower arm, because it's the one that's furthest out towards the tire versus the inners are at the center of the pumpkin, so any roll is going to be pretty minimal as far as how much they move in the center, unless you're in a straight line and getting a big compression or a big compression bump. But as you can see, just as I swing this arm back and forth, you can see that in an angle like this, which is aggressive or just for demonstration purposes here, is a shorter wheelbase than if it's up here close to level. Then the axle will be as far back as it can. It's this arc that makes roll steer. So when our arms have an angle upward to the front, and then if I was taking a left-hand turn, this is the passenger side of the car, it would compress, so the car would come down, or rather, the tire and axle will go up into the car during that roll. This would then push this tire and corner of the axle backwards, lengthening the wheelbase on this side of the car. Meanwhile, the opposite will be happening on the other side of the car, provided you don't have a super stiff sway bar. In which case, that will actually be dropping and it will be shortening the wheelbase on the driver's side of the car in a left-hand turn. What this does is it'll be kind of like doing a forklift motion where all of a sudden, you know, your front's fixed and the rear end will twist like this. And that'll help you rotate and go round into a corner. With this, and this works very well. I've tested with it quite a bunch, and I find like a balance where the car, if I have the arms pretty much level, the car's pretty tight, like it'll drive off corner really nice, but it doesn't want to rotate getting into a corner. Versus as I put more angle into it there, it starts getting a lot more lively going into the corner. And I have gone too far where it's quite a handful on the brakes and turn in, where it'll actually, the back end will try to step out on you, but not so much step out like loss of traction, but just to stop out where the car starts to rotate much quicker than you want it to. So by having an adjustable lower mount, I'm able to go up or down and tune how much the car wants to do that extra rotation in the corner. By going with the 3-link and getting the longer upper arm, I still have all that roll tuning in the lower, but the longer upper arm, what little bit of movement it does see, will be more stable because it'll be a longer arm versus a shorter one. So its arc that it will travel through is going to be a much softer change in angle. So for example, if I had a short, say a 6-inch arm, and it moved 1 degree, that 1 degree is going to be half the distance that if I had a 12-inch arm would be to also make 1 degree. So the longer the arm gets, the more it has to move to make the same angle change. And by stabilizing that angle change on that upper link, we then get more tuning capability out of the lower where it's not making such a big change all at once. Now to talk about generating traction on throttle. This is also controlled by the lower arm and the angle that it's at. It's also controlled by the upper arms and the angle they're at. Now your lower arm, now if you want to picture, we got our wheel out here, and when we're on throttle, it's rotating that way. So as it spins in this direction, it's pushing the axle forward, and through the arms is pushing the car forward. So if we're dead level on our arms, we're just getting a straight push. As the arm comes up towards the front of the car, it's actually creating a lifting motion because now we're pushing at an upward angle. It doesn't have to be a ton to make a difference, because you can actually feel this if you go out and have an adjustable lower control arm angle, and even just go out and try to make some slow acceleration hits, like if the tire breaks loose and you start adding more angle to it, you'll be able to notice how much more grip you can pick up just by adding some angle to that. Now this is where things get to where you can start looking at drag race application kind of stuff, because this is more of an anti-squat kind of territory when we're looking at it just two-dimensionally like this. And as that arm comes up, the steeper the angle, the more it's going to push up. Well, that pushing up effect actually increases the weight of the car upon the rear axle and therefore the tire. What needs to also be considered is the angle of the upper arm. And this is where it's counterintuitive, because You would think, oh, well, the lower arm, that's angled up, the axle's pushing forward, like that's lift, we need to angle that one up as well. Not the case, because what the upper arm sees is, because of this tire rotation, is also the tendency to twist the axle back. And why it's just the upper arm and not the lower is because as the axle twists, it's trying to lay down and point the pinion up at the sky. Well, that motion is still pushing the lower arm forward and in an upward direction. However, it is pulling on the upper arm. And what that does is, if you have it pointed in an upward direction, now it's pulling the car down and it's trying to lift the axle up off of the ground. And you're not increasing the bite of the tire because you're taking weight off of it. So the upper arms actually tend to have a downward angle so that when they twist, they will pull and also be trying to lift the weight of the car up above the axle. And that helps increase your rear traction. Where it gets messy is because these two things work great when you're talking drag racing in a straight line, and your anti-squat, that's a great way to tune that. However, that kind of goes out the window in a corner, and that's where, like we were just talking about roll steer in the rear, largely controlled by the lower control arm. You can get two things there, but if you want a ton of bite, but not a lot of roll steer, then you're kind of stuck. You have to figure out a different way to do it, which can possibly be accomplished with the upper arm. Or if you want a lot of roll steer and a lot of bite, you can put a really steep angle in that lower. But then if you're getting a lot of body roll as well, you're not only going to be increasing the amount of rear steer you have, but you're also going to be drastically changing the amount of pinion angle change that is going on. And that can be its own set of problems with vibrations and shaking and everything else. So really it's a matter about finding a balance, and this is why I want to make it so that we can have lots of ways to tune this. The more adjustment I have, the more I can find that sweet spot. So, is a 3-link right for you? I think it's the right answer for me, but everybody might have a little different situation. If you want to actually do a little more research, you can try. I mean, I've done my fair share, and I've kind of come up empty-handed, which is why I'm making this video, because I feel like maybe some other people have ended up there too. I would say if you're looking for information on pinion angle and how that's effective, by all means, that Garage Fab video, that's fantastic there. Like I said, link in the description. If you're looking for your anti-squat and traction on throttle in a straight line, remember, you can look at any of a number of drag racing related stuff. There's probably hundreds of videos on YouTube. They pop up everywhere. Doesn't matter what time is to type in 3-link, you'll get 4-link stuff that's related to that. If you're looking for more information as far as how roll steer works, then your best bet is to start looking at circle track applications, specifically dirt, because those guys get a lot more roll steer than anything that asphalt does because they have such large amounts of suspension travel on those cars. But the theory is there. It's right. I can't remember the website off the top of my head. Maybe I'll go look it up. I'll throw it in the description. One that I really looked at that really laid it out, good diagrams as far as the different arcs that all the arms will go through based on where they're mounted and what angle they're at ride height. If you're looking for information as far as the tuning of the roll center, that's a little more difficult. There's information out there, and almost everything comes back, you have to try it, because every chassis is going to be a little different. Spring rates, shock rates, all that's going to affect it. And that's a big reason why I think an adjustable setup is the way to go. Whether it be a Panhard bar or a Watts link, it really doesn't matter. Just make sure you have a way to adjust it so that you can tune the handling of the car to suit your driving style. Or to see what's fast and then adapt your driving style if need be. As far as overall general design, what I've found across most of all that information is the longer the arms are, the easier it is to tune and control because they won't go through as big of a sweep through chassis movement. That's hard to do with packaging. I mean, it's even a difficult job in the G-body here, where I've actually got enough room to put a longer arm in and offset the mounts to the rear a bit. But if I wanted to do anything beyond about what I'm doing, I'd have to start cutting out the floor in the back seat area, or even the trunk, so I could put a higher link mount. That's one thing I didn't find a lot of information on, was how far away from axle center line the mount should be. The best I could find for some information was like a 5 to 7 inch range. But again, I mean, the farther away from axle center line is, the more leverage it's going to give to that arm. So like if the uppers were really close to center line and the lowers were really far away, there's going to be a difference of how that applies the mechanical leverage during acceleration and cornering and all that. Mostly there, I think, just don't get too far out of the ballpark. I mean, I'm just trying to keep things simple. You know, stick to the KISS method. That's why I'm trying to reuse the lower arms. I mean, really, they're the longest arm anyway to start out on this car. There's already mounts. I already know that what I can do tuning-wise with adjusting the height of the axle side. So really, I just want to limit my changes to where I know what I can change with the lower arm. The upper arm will be a learning experience, as will the roll center. But I don't want to go like completely revamping everything at once, so that's why my choice was to reuse that. One other option that I looked at was, if I decided to cut into the back seat area and the floor, would be putting a much longer arm in. And what I found that relates to is, the longer the arm, you move your pivot point further forward in the car. That way, when you accelerate, your weight transfer pivot point is where those arms mount at. And the further forward it is, the more you're going to pivot. You're moving from, it pivots near the rear axle, how much weight transfer you're going to get, versus if, for example, let's exaggerate and say the pivot point was actually way up by the engine. When you accelerate, almost the entire car weight is transferring immediately right to that rear tire, and it's going to plant. This is one of the reasons why truck arms work so good in a NASCAR application, is they pivot way up by the transmission, whether it's near the tail shaft or even near the center of the transmission. It actually puts a ton of that weight transfer onto the rear, and that's why they accelerate so good off of corners. But that truck arm suspension does have lots of compromises as well. For one thing, it doesn't do roll steer very well, and I'm not quite sure how well it does for roll center heights either. But that long arm makes a good weight transfer, so applying that theory to other linked arms, it makes good weight transfer. You look at old drag cars there, when they put in a big ladder bar, they're making that weight transfer point much farther forward. So we can use the same theory and apply that with a shorter arm than something that drastic, but as long as we're making it longer than what we've got, we should be getting some benefit from that. And really the thing here is, there's no right answer one way or another. Not with the design of your 3-link setup, not in how you actually build it, not in pretty much anything. It's just build it. You got to start somewhere, and the more adjustability you build in, the more likely you are to be able to find a good spot. And every car is going to be different there. I could tell somebody how to build exactly what I'm building, and when I get out and go testing, my car is going to be completely different than their car, even if it's still a G-body, because we're going to have different weights and possibly different tire sizes and track width. There's no shortage of things that can be different. So it's all a matter of making something, and the goal is make it better than what you have. Make it better than stock, because we don't need to make a perfect setup. I mean, if somebody wants to sit down and engineer that for hours and hours and hours on end in a computer, cool. You put it in the car, it might not work the way the computer says it will. That's why R&D and testing are a thing. So just make the goal of making it better than what you have, better than your stock setup, and go out and make some difference. Try it out. Make the car handle better, make it faster.